This lecture is going to try and delve into the very complex and very controversial issue of the relationship between livestock and climate change, and particularly extensive livestock, making the important point, and I might as well offer the conclusion at the beginning, that extensive and particularly mobile livestock, as managed by pastoralists around the world, is very, very different in respect of its impacts and the consequences for climate change. And we've got to differentiate between the two. So much of this debate has become muddled. So much of this debate has involved casting livestock in general in a very simplistic light. Livestock, in other words, have become the villains of climate change, provoking widespread demands for the reduction in livestock production, even its outright banning and switches to plant-based or cultured meat or milk diets. Methane, what animals, herbivores, ruminants in general burp, has become a big issue in climate change debates. And reducing methane emissions, including from livestock, is seen as a quick win for climate mitigation. For example, the European Union and the United States launched the Global Methane Pledge at COP26, and 100 countries signed up collectively to reduce methane by 30% by 2030. This is a really important challenge, but before we race to restricting livestock production to meet these climate targets, we must remember that the relationships between cows and the climate is much more complex than the media, the think tanks, the campaign groups, the celebrities and others, including some on this slide, like to think. I want to argue that the distortions in the policy debate create major forms of injustice that development agencies and others need to address. And these are a variety of different injustices that we'll come to during the lecture. These are epistemic injustices around knowledge and the framings of the way the debate happens. Procedural injustices around how data are reported and used in policy, particularly procedures associated with the IPCC system, with the wider COP system, and the whole set of approaches for climate reporting that are evolving now. And then there are very fundamental distributional injustices around who wins and who loses from this debate. None of this is to say that livestock are not part of the problem, but they can also be part of the solution. But we have to think about which livestock and where. We produced a report, Are Livestock Always Bad for the Planet?, which is on the reading list for this lecture. And it was published by PASTRES together with 13 other organizations. And it gets into some of the data questions and challenges some of the assumptions on which many policy statements are based. Its analysis focuses on a particular type of modeling, or at least the application of a particular type of modeling, life cycle assessment. This is used in these big reports that we see about climate change to define what climate impacts are likely to occur from what sources. And in turn frames the way policy, climate policy, and indeed many of the media and campaign positions that emerge. But this form of assessment, if used poorly, we argue, can cause distortions and so injustices. And these injustices are meted out to some of the world's poorest and marginalized people, pastoralists. The type of modeling, life cycle assessment, is used very widely, and it's used to assess how different greenhouse gases influence global warming through looking at all the inputs and all the outputs from production, from all the way from production on a rangeland or in a livestock keeping shed, right the way through to retail and sometimes onto consumption. And these assessments have been used in a number of important studies, that have had huge influence on this debate to assess the impact of livestock on emissions, including the two in this slide, both from the FAO. The figure most often repeated is that livestock contribute 14.5% of the total anthropogenic emissions, mostly through methane. The figure that comes from these reports is repeated again and again and has become iconic in various campaigns and media commentaries with all sorts of false claims about the equivalence, for example, between cars and cows. In one particular LCA analysis published in the very reputable journal Science in 2018, The Guardian ran the headline, "Avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way to reduce your impact on Earth." Is this really the case? And if followed through, who would be the winners and who would be the losers? We have to ask, does this apply to pastoral and other extensive livestock systems? The simple answer is no. Pastoralists occupy the world's rangelands from a huge variety of different settings. Here are four from the PASTRES work, from Tunisia, from Kenya, from Western India to Sardinia in Italy. They tend a huge variety of different animals, cattle, yaks, camels, goats, sheep, reindeer, and they supply goods and markets in a variety of different ways. And through light, mobile grazing and herding practice, they can enhance biodiversity, as we've discussed in another lecture, but they can also sequester carbon and nitrogen and preserve landscapes. So pastoralists and their impact on climate change are different to industrial livestock production. They should not be lumped together with contained intensive systems with imported feed, high reliance on infrastructure, transport, and so on, as is too often done in the wider debate. The consequence is that pastoralists, who can actually be good for the environment, suffer the same policy moves to reduce livestock numbers, change diets, enclose or rewild landscapes that were once grazing land as part of this overall environmental move. In the PASTRES report, we investigated the detailed lives of life cycle analysis models and their wider politics. And to cut a very long story short, such models have a number of systematic biases in the data, a set of gaps and assumptions that cause major distortions. And we identified a number, including biases in the data, problems with the way systems were defined, and issues around baselines, how baselines are calculated and assessed in these models. The net consequence of all of this is that they consistently overestimate the impact of extensive livestock systems, and they underestimate their value. And a number of studies show that such systems can actually have neutral, even negative carbon balance under certain conditions, while contributing to improving biodiversity and so on. We looked at a number of cases, including ones from China, ones from Sardinia, there were several from Spain, a number which have, and indeed from Kenya, there were a number of studies which now have used, indeed, adapted forms of life cycle assessments to add in all of the aspects of what an extensive livestock system, what impacts it has. It's a difficult task, and assumptions still have to be made. But actually, if you don't use just the way that they're conventionally done, very different results happen. Indeed, for extensive systems compared to more settled and contained systems, we see a much smaller impact on the environment, both in a per area basis, obviously, but also through other calculations that assess impacts. The problem is, in some, is that a focus on particular systems, high input intensive systems, And a failure to understand other extensive low input systems means that very misleading assessments about products, meat and milk, are generated. It's not the product, it's the process by which such products are produced, and we need to differentiate. The problem is that the mainstream assessments are published often in fancy journals like Science. They're repeated in the media, like that headline in the Guardian newspaper, and then they're taken up by campaign organizations, celebrities, and others, and then become part and parcel of the mechanics of policy statements, reporting, verification systems, and so on. These are the type of injustices that we need to call out and think about. So let's have a look at a few examples of where the problems lie and why arguments that all livestock are bad for the planet are seriously misplaced. First, global assessments are frequently, overwhelmingly based on data from industrial systems. That's where the data is collected. A very frequently quoted paper, that one I mentioned from Science, looked at 38,700 farms, 1,600 processors, but it only focused on so-called commercially viable units. And they were mostly from Europe and North America. But as I've said before, not all livestock are the same, meaning that the global extrapolations that come from such papers don't work. So work carried out in Kenya under the auspices of the Mazingira Institute from ILRI are showing that assumptions about emissions from African animals are often wildly inaccurate. Such livestock are smaller, have higher quality diets due to selective grazing, have physiologies adapted to their settings. They're not the same as highly bred animals in a respiration chamber where much of the data on emission factors come from. Overall, data from extensive systems are massively underrepresented. For example, a review of life cycle assessments of food production shows that only 0.4% of such studies were from Africa, where extensive pastoralism is common across large areas. Second, most assessments focus on emission impacts per animal or per unit of product. This creates a distorted picture as the wider costs and benefits are not taken into account. Those in favor of industrialized systems point to the high per animal methane emission from animals eating rough, low quality forage on open rangelands, such as these sheep in Sardinia, compared to the potential for improved methane reducing feeds in contained systems. But this, in my mind, misses the point. A wider, more integrated systems approach must encompass all impacts, but also benefits. Third, methane and carbon dioxide have very different properties, different lifetimes in the atmosphere. They're not the same. Methane is short-lived, but it's also highly potent. Carbon dioxide sticks around, by contrast, in the atmosphere effectively forever. Reducing warming can be addressed in the short term, for sure, by tackling methane emissions, but for long-term climate change mitigation, we need to focus on carbon and carbon dioxide. It therefore makes a big difference about how different greenhouse gases are assessed and how any so-called global warming potential, a key factor in a lot of the equations that come up with impact assessment, how that's estimated needs to be elaborated in a more nuanced way. And some work has been done on that in recent years. The basic point is that cows producing methane and cars producing carbon dioxide and other emissions are not the same. Fourth, what baseline is used is also important. In extensive systems, livestock very often replace wild herbivores, which also, of course, emit greenhouse gases. Pastoral systems may therefore not result in additional emissions from a natural baseline. They just simply replace other emissions. Studies from the Great Plains of North America suggest that in the past, bison and other herbivores were emitting vast amounts of greenhouse gases, perhaps comparable to livestock populations that exist in extensive systems today. Indeed, some forms of extensive grazing can potentially increase carbon stocks, as I've mentioned before, adding to the already significant stock of carbon in open rangelands, a system that we still do not understand well, the carbon dynamics in grasslands and rangelands. But contrast this with industrial systems where we do know what's happening. These industrial systems are clearly additional, they're clearly polluting. They're adding significant emissions as well as other impacts through the importation of feed, the concentration of waste, the cost of transport, and sunk infrastructure in concrete and so on. Very different systems. But if we look at a pastoral system in a more systems-orientated way, and this is a study from northern Senegal, from the Ferlo region, carried out by researchers from CIRAD and others, we see a much more complex interaction of different aspects of inputs and outputs. It's these type of systems properties, these type of process of both emission and sequestration, and the management across space through movement that needs to be understood in a much more detailed way. We should not lump in pastoral systems with wider industrial systems in our urge, which is absolutely essential to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and deal with climate change. What does all this mean for policy and practice? Overall, as I've said many times before in the talk already, we need to distinguish between different production systems. It's the systems that matter, not the products, not the animals per se. Lumping everything together just doesn't make sense. They're very different. But a generalized narrative, as we hear again and again, that all livestock are bad for the planet and that we need to change our ways, get rid of livestock, change our diets and so on, is too simplistic. It results in a series of injustices. These are, as I said before, epistemic injustices through the promotion of particular forms of data, particular models, procedural injustices through the use of such data in global assessments, verification, reporting, and distributive injustices where pastoralists basically lose out. All of these injustices need to be thought about together with the science. Science and questions of justice and equity should not be separated in policy processes. Simplistic forms of climate change advocacy by environmentalists, well-meaning as they are, may miss their target if they misuse the models and the data and don't understand them. And this can undermine people's livelihoods and pastoralist environments. And that's why it's really important for all of us engaged with pastoral development and pastoralism more broadly, is to get into this debate, understand the science, reflect on it, encourage others to collect new data and elaborate an argument that is more sophisticated. This is not to deny that there are negative effects of livestock production. There always are, but we can manage those if we think about systems, not just products and particular animals. And this is why I think a justice focus is essential. A more differentiated perspective that accepts pastoral production systems, can make use of harsh rangeland environments, that they can enhance environmental services and values through including carbon sequestration. And they can offer also high quality protein and other micronutrients in diets, particularly for poorer and more marginalized people in certain parts of the world. This is not an argument, I say it again, for diet change. Climate mitigation involves changing production systems in other parts of the world. But remember, pastoral systems are an important part of global production and global livelihoods, occupying half the world's land surface, and therefore should not be ignored in this crucial debate. So in sum, to conclude, we can learn a lot from how pastoralists confront uncertain environments, and how it's a focus on the production process, not the product, that's important. We need to challenge the assumptions around existing data and models and adopt a more integrated systems approach. We need to avoid quick fix solutions that are distorting, such as cultured meat or rewilding and so on, and think about, or simplistic diet change recommendations, as we saw from the Eat Lancet report, and think about a more integrated approach. And we need to bring, most fundamentally, pastoralists into these global conservation conversations about climate change, mitigation and adaptation and the future of food systems. And currently, they're mostly excluded. So finally, have a look at the reading lists that are associated with this lecture, and particularly dip into the Livestock report that we produced and also the briefing papers that are associated with it, and use this information productively to engage with the wider debate. Thank you.